Well, thank you for that. Senator Ossoff, you are now recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists for your invaluable contributions today. Mr. Henderson, I'd like to begin with a question directed to you. You noted in your testimony that in 2017, the Department of Justice found that while just over 7,000 hate crimes had been reported, they assessed that the real number was likely in the range of 250,000. What legislative action is needed to ensure we have a clear national accounting of hate crimes that's accurate and consistent over time so that we can track these trends with more accuracy?
Senator Ossoff, thank you for that question. As you know, there is the Hate Crimes Statistics Act, which I believe was first enacted in 1991. It requires police departments around the country, law enforcement institutions, to report hate crimes that have been brought to their attention. But the information provided to the federal government is voluntary. The number of police departments that participate in this effort has always been relatively small in comparison to the number of entities existing in the country. And most of the information provided is incredibly incomplete, but there is no sense of urgency, no sense of obligation on the part of these departments to provide that information. Certainly, Congress could make reporting mandatory, and that would help, and certainly providing departments with the technical skill to document and record hate crime violence reported to those institutions would be a huge help. And lastly, public education, trying to educate communities about the existence of this violence, what constitutes a hate crime, and how to go about documenting it would be an additional help. So I would argue that strengthening the Hate Crime Statistics Act is the first and most compelling step to be taken, but I think there are other collateral efforts, as we have just discussed, that could be supportive of that effort as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Would you kindly be willing to work with my office to determine how such legislative remedy might be most constructively drafted?
Senator Ossoff, we would welcome that opportunity and appreciate very much the invitation to do so.
Thank you very much. Mr. Yang, I'd like to check in with you on a matter of particular concern across the country and to many of my Asian American constituents in Georgia, and that is these appalling attacks in particular on Asian elders across the country, which you note in your testimony. Would you please provide the committee with an update on the trend, the incidence of these attacks, what you're currently seeing and analyzing?
Sure. Thank you very much for that question, Senator Ossoff. And unfortunately, the trend has still been relatively high with respect to attacks against Asian Americans. And again, we've talked about there's one thing I should note is that the attacks against Asian American women in particular is appalling. Women are being attacked at almost 2 times the rate of men. And this is not an issue just for the Asian American community, but if we are talking about domestic terrorism, if we're talking about extremism, another issue that we need to make sure that we address is violence against women. And unfortunately, with respect to this hearing, we don't have a female speaker to talk about these issues. But if we dig deeper, that's another issue that we should address. The last thing that I would want to note is that we should also continue to think about what it means to prevent these types of issues, these types of acts from happening. And we've talked a lot about response, how we need to harden some of our nonprofits, harden some of our churches. And I certainly agree with that as a response. But we also need to think about how we connect with our communities, invest in our communities so they feel safer. They feel safer without the need to criminalize or use law enforcement as the solution to all of these problems.
Thank you, Mr. Yang. Mr. Fingerhut, I'd like to talk a bit about federal policy that helps to secure places of worship as well as nonprofits. I would just note it's on the one hand, a signal of progress. I think that Georgia elected for the first time a Black man and a Jewish man to represent our state in the U.S. Senate. I was sworn in on the Chumash that belonged to Rabbi Jacob Rothschild, who'd been the chief rabbi at my childhood synagogue, the Temple, which was bombed by white supremacists in 1958 in retaliation for Rabbi Rothschild's alliance with Dr. King in support of the civil rights movement. And it is certainly my ambition that we strengthen and sustain the vital and historic alliance between Blacks and Jews in America, which was forged with such intensity during the civil rights movement. I'd like to ask you, Mr. Fingerhut, about your assessment of the efficacy of the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, how it can be improved, as well as the efficacy of the DHS Protective Security Advisors and Cybersecurity Advisors, which are assisting nonprofits and faith-based groups to protect themselves from both physical and cyber threats.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff, for the question. And the historic significance of your election and that of Senator Warnock was certainly well noted within the community, as was the dramatic personal statement you made with regard to your choice of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, for your swearing in. And we commit to you, together, of course, with the Jewish Federations located in your home state of Georgia, particularly, of course, our great Atlanta Jewish Federation, to work as closely with you and Senator Warnock as we possibly can, as well as on a national basis to fulfill the vision that you've so beautifully laid out for us here. As I have addressed in this hearing, it is unfortunately the case that we now have a wide recognition, Senator, of the need to have a layer of physical security in all of our faith-based institutions and our nonprofit institutions that we never thought we would have to have. As you travel the world, it is routine that there are security guards and physical security of all kinds outside of faith-based institutions, and we regret that reality has now come to our great country. We are in catch-up mode, frankly, sir, because there is not only the growing need, which the federal government is not yet adequately funding. The funding levels that are currently available, as has already been noted, covered roughly 50% of the applications this year, but even that is only a reflection of the knowledge and the growing capacity of institutions to apply. It's nowhere near where we believe all of the faith-based institutions and communities need to be. So we need long-term, consistent funding. We need the expertise of FEMA and of our state emergency institutions to partner with FEMA to get this done. And as you suggested, our cyber advisors, we need to have a much closer working relationship between the protective security advisors and the cybersecurity advisors in the Department of Homeland Security Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency and the nonprofit community. We believe all of that can come from the designation of the faith-based institutions and nonprofits as critical infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Fingerhut. With the chairman's indulgence, just one more question for Mr. Goldenberg. You noted in your testimony some of the parallels with Europe, this increase in sectarianism, tribalism that we're seeing in European and North American societies right now. As we all strive to build a society and a world where the dignity and the human rights and the human value of each individual is sacred and protected regardless of our race, our creed, our ethnicity, our faith, it's deeply troubling that we're seeing this increase in these levels of sectarianism and hatred. And I'd like, in closing, Mr. Goldenberg, if you might comment on why do you believe we're seeing these trends in societies on both sides of the Atlantic? What are the parallels?
I think the parallels, well, look, I first started to travel abroad almost nearly 20 years ago at the request of the OSCE, the Office for Security and Cooperation for Europe. And we started to raise the flags back then when we started to see these groups that were considered once marginalized becoming mainstream. There's a total disconnect, although it's gotten much better in Europe with vulnerable communities and the police that are sworn to protect them as well. But again, for the record, that has improved greatly. Social media has no borders. These ideologies seem to have no borders, and people are sharing this information across the globe with a click of a finger. Where years ago these things took much longer. You heard Senator Portman mention flash to bang, and what that really means, flash to bang, is that people are being radicalized. They are sitting in front of computers. They're frustrated potentially with their own governments for whatever reason, and they're moving from flash to operationalizing these targeted acts of violence. I think that the social media, the internet, has become a place where these ideologies and and the methodologies for attack are being shared almost on a daily basis. Wherever you have, as we all know, a downturn in the economy, people will look to scapegoat. In this case, I think COVID has accelerated much of that. For the first time in history, billions of people were home sitting in front of their computers and depending on information that they weren't sure is factual or not factual. So we're in a very fragile place right now, and what we've seen 10, 15 years ago, as I stated, 20 years ago in Europe, has come to fruition here in the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Goldenberg. Thank you to our panel, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thanks for the extra time.